All right, well, welcome to a few notes and thoughts before we discuss Do the Right Thing on Thursday. Thanks for clicking through and listening to this. Won't take up too much time, but I just want to share a couple of ideas before you watch Do the Right Thing, so you have a few sort of thoughts and questions in mind to consider as you watch the film. The first thinker we talked briefly about today is Immanuel Kant, who makes the case that good and bad are really at the heart of the government equation. As it says here, the only absolutely good thing in the universe is the human will governed by respect for moral law. What does that mean? Everything comes down to whether something is right or wrong. There are no caveats. There are no questions about it. It is either right or it is wrong. It is universally right. It's universally wrong. And as the second point makes clear, the consequences don't matter. So what does that mean? You see a starving person and you want to steal a loaf of bread for them so that they eat. Kant would say, if the act is wrong, the consequence of it, regardless of who it benefits, can't be justified. Kant is cited in a lot of court cases, especially those who are seeking vigorous sentences in the case that something is right or wrong and the consequences don't matter. In other words, you sentence someone to 10 years in prison for a crime. It doesn't matter that the person is 75 years old and isn't going to live 10 years. The sentence is justified. It is absolute. It is right or wrong. The consequence matters not one bit. So Kant is a believer in universals and that our behavior always should be guided by this. And if the consequence doesn't matter, then there aren't moments that justify stepping outside of what we would normally define as acceptable. And you think about the implication of this, there's no room for violent rebellion in Kant's world. If you're violently rebelling, if you're seeking this larger good, Kant would say it doesn't matter. The act, the thing that we can define is the act. The thing that's definite is the act. The larger good is A, theoretical. Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. And B, no good can come out of the bad act, so it can't be justified. Kant therefore believes that our behavior, as the third point here notes, should be as if we were the most powerful person in the world. Our behavior should be as if our actions set a standard for everyone, because the moral law is basic and it's fundamental. And if we are acting morally, one way to sort of test that is, would we want everyone else to act the way we act? If we're acting morally, the answer should be a clear yes. If we're acting morally, then those gray areas, is this acceptable, is this not acceptable, are clear. They're bright. And again, the consequence of all this doesn't matter. Now, part of this, of course, leaves you in the vulnerable position of acting in a way that you think is good when others are not acting that way. And for Kant, you're left with the relatively, sort of mild satisfaction that you're setting the example. There's a certain amount of vulnerability in this line of thinking if you're the good one and everyone else is stepping out of those boundaries. All right, now Freud, by the other hand, as you saw in the readings, makes a case that there really isn't within humans a core right and wrong. Instead, Freud would say our lives are built around the presence of control or the presence of chaos. The presence of control being a life more or less the upside of Hobbes' argument a life where progress is possible. The absence of control, chaos, is the state of nature, as Hobbes would have it. And so what does Freud say is at bottom the ruling principle of our lives? The universal law of human behavior is aggression, Freud argues. We are inclined to aggression. And it's built into us. He says, the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself is a commandment which is really justified by the fact that nothing else runs so strongly counter to the original nature of man. As it says here in bullet 2, civilization has to use its utmost efforts in order to set limits to man's aggressive instincts. And for Freud, this is not at bottom an economic question. This is not at bottom as Hobbes would have it, and as Locke would have it, and as others would have made the case. This is not at bottom about what I have and what you have. Freud makes the case there's aggressiveness in us before property exists, whether that be property in sort of a civilization terms or even property in a personal term. He makes the case toddlers are aggressive. Even if they don't have anything, and even if there isn't anything for them to take, they're aggressive. And that aggressiveness is the basis of every human interaction. Now, you take Kant and you take Freud, and you ask the question, what is government's task here? What is our capacity or justification for rebelling? You put these two ideas together, and you get a very different notion of what governs us, what guides us, what defines our lives. And at bottom, as we started from day one talking about this idea of progress and government as a potential source of progress, Kant makes the case there's one path toward progress, and it's through morality. And a good government, a successful government, a government that actually does those things that we started out on day one saying is the very purpose of government. Kant says all that starts with morality. If the government is making decisions for the good, life progresses. If government, again, is not focused on the consequences of the here and now and today, but on the basic questions of good and bad, the government is good, we move toward a better life. And every other question, everything else, every other question, every other condition is secondary. Freud, on the other hand, who makes this case that we're fundamentally aggressive no matter what kind of standard you imagine, Freud argues progress comes from control. It's not that government teaches us to be good boys and girls. Government, when it has the levers of power, when it has authority, when it has the capacity to constrain our natural inclinations, makes progress possible. When it keeps us from acting up, it makes progress possible. These are two very, very different views when you get to the question of how government succeeds or how government fails, how government moves us forward or how government denies us a sense of progress. Kant would say those sort of totalitarian governments of the world, or any form of government where morality isn't the guiding principle, is a government in failure. Freud would say some of those totalitarian governments are very good at keeping the trains running on time. They're very good at keeping people from acting up against each other, and they are a step, therefore, toward progress. Now, in Do the Right Thing and next week in Twilight's Last Gleaming, we're going to be looking at questions of rebellion. What motivates people to rise up against their government? And as we've talked about throughout the course, we've been looking at questions of fundamentally what defines our need from government. And for Kant, what is rebellion? Rebellion is moral failure. It's moral failure on the part of the government to teach us to do the right thing. It's moral failure on the part of the government in its failure to set that example. Just as we are to act as if we are the monarchs of the universe, government, literally the monarchs of the universe, are to act forever on that plane. And so, what is rebellion? It's a failure of morality at the government level that's then replicated as a failure on our individual level. Because we shouldn't be rebelling. We shouldn't be taking up arms against our government or against our fellow citizens. We shouldn't be acting in lawless ways and rioting ever under any capacity. If the individual action is wrong, then the larger cause is irrelevant. So what is rebellion to Kant? It's moral failure. Freud, on the other hand, where does this rebellion come from? Rebellion comes from a lack of capacity to recognize our true nature. If you recognize that we are aggressive by nature, then you impose controls on us. If you impose controls on us, then you don't allow the aggression to come out. You don't allow our natural inclinations, our natural behavior to come out. You look at these two views and you get very different, very diametrically opposed notions of two things: who we are fundamentally. Kant makes a case there's within us this good that wants to come out. Freud makes the case there's within us this aggression that wants to come out. And you get a very different view, therefore, of what government must do to respond. To Kant, it is a government that sets an example to let the good in us out. To Freud, it's a government that imposes controls to keep the bad within us. You put those two things together, you get a very different sense of rebellion. You get rebellion in Kant's perspective that is a failure of morality. You get rebellion from Freud's perspective as a failure of control. Then the implication, of course, where do you go from a breakdown? What's next? In Kant's position, of course, what's next is you go back to your first principles. You go back to what's good. In Freud's perspective, you order more tanks and you impose your will more clearly. I wanted to share some of these thoughts with you before you watch Do the Right Thing to get you thinking about this very fundamental question of this rebellion in Do the Right Thing and whether it's justified from any direction and where it comes from. Whose failure does it reflect? And so as you're watching the movie, I'd encourage you to think about some of these core questions. You know, much of the action starts with a dispute over pictures on the wall of the pizza place. Why? What's this dispute really about? You'll see in this film, reflecting topics we've been talking about for the last few sessions, such strong enemy images, almost defining every aspect of some of these characters' lives. Why? Where did they come from? Why are they so strong? Very, very big question regarding the sort of the outcome of the film and the message of the film. Has government failed here in these characters' lives? And if so, why? Has it failed in a Kant-like way by failing to establish a moral premise? Or has it failed in Freud's perspective by failing to establish control? And then the follow-up then, if government's failed, are we free to rebel? Should we rebel? Should there be a response from the citizens of the neighborhood against what the government's representatives do in the film? Is that justified in any way? If they do something wrong, to protest something wrong, is there a justification for this? And then finally, what in the end do you find this to be a story about? Is it about violence? Is it about tolerance? Is it about understanding? You know, do the right thing is a line that one of the characters, the mayor, says during the film. What is the right thing? What do you take as the final point of the film? as you watch the film, as I said, try and keep in mind some of the topics that we've dealt with in the last few weeks over enemy images. Think a little bit about whether this is ultimately a story about right and wrong, or is this ultimately a story about basic questions of control. And with that, I will see you on Thursday for Do the Right Thing, and I appreciate you stopping by and listening to this.